Ruth Langston had worked the graveyard shift at Meriton Global for over 12 years, and not once had anyone ever remembered her name. She swept, scrubbed, and polished in silence, moving like a shadow between cubicles and conference rooms, never interrupting, never making a sound unless spoken to. She wore the same faded navy blue uniform every night, hair pulled into a tight bun, with a small name badge that most people never read. At best, she was a polite nod in the hallway. At worst, completely unseen. But Ruth didn't mind. Not really. She had learned long ago that invisibility had its advantages. No one asked questions. No one pried. And most importantly, no one expected anything. It allowed her to move through the world on her own terms, with her own thoughts, her own rhythm. The quiet gave her peace. It was a Tuesday morning when everything changed. The marble lobby of Meriton's Dallas headquarters gleamed under the overhead lights. The city was just beginning to stir, with the soft hum of traffic outside and the buzz of shoes tapping across the polished floor inside. Executives with coffee in hand spoke in hushed tones about sales reports and quarterly goals. Phones pinged. Doors hissed open. The day had begun. Ruth was kneeling by the base of the directory kiosk, mopping around the edges with methodical precision. She didn't expect anyone to notice her. They never did. Until she heard someone arguing nearby. A man in his late 60s stood near the front desk, looking flustered. He wore a dark suit and carried a briefcase that looked too heavy for him. His forehead glistened with sweat as he gestured frantically toward the elevators. The receptionist looked confused, trying to communicate in English, but it was clear the man didn't understand. Ruth glanced up. She recognized the accent immediately. Mandarin, slightly northern, with a touch of Shanghai tone. She stood up slowly, wiped her hands on her apron, and approached. "Nin hao," she said gently. "Shuyao bang mang ma." The man's eyes widened. Relief washed over his face. Ruth smiled and continued, her voice calm and confident, explaining how to reach the 15th floor accounting department. He nodded gratefully, bowing slightly before heading toward the elevators. That's when she heard it. Footsteps behind her. Slower than usual. Hesitant. Ruth turned and saw a tall man in a tailored charcoal suit staring at her, eyebrows raised, mouth slightly open like he'd just seen something impossible. It was Michael Granger. The CEO. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Ruth straightened her posture, unsure if she was in trouble or had simply broken some unspoken rule of being too helpful. Was that Mandarin? Michael asked, his voice low. "Yes, sir," she said quickly. The gentleman was lost. "You speak it fluently?" "I do." There was a pause. "And the Spanish you used yesterday with the delivery team? That was you too, right?" "Yes, sir." He folded his arms. "And the French last week with the food vendor?" "Yes, sir." "That too." Ruth didn't offer anything else. She never volunteered information. It was a habit formed from years of being overlooked and underestimated. Michael looked at her for a long moment, trying to piece her together. She wasn't showy. There was no pride in her tone. Just quiet, unwavering truth. "How many languages do you speak?" he asked, finally. 9, she replied. "And I read Latin, though I wouldn't say I'm fluent." His jaw shifted slightly. Ruth couldn't tell if it was confusion or discomfort, or maybe something deeper. Guilt, perhaps. Michael Granger had run Meriton's global operations for nearly 2 decades. He'd overseen expansions into 5 continents, signed multi-million-dollar contracts in 5-star hotel lobbies, and interviewed Harvard grads fluent in corporate buzzwords. Yet here, right in his own building, was a woman more linguistically capable than half his executive team, holding a mop. "What's your name?" he asked. "Ruth Langston." "Miss Langston, are you free for a few minutes?" She hesitated. The question itself felt strange, like something from another world. Right now? Yes. I'd like to speak with you. In my office. There was no edge in his tone. No demand. Just curiosity, and something else Ruth couldn't quite place. Respect. She nodded slowly. All right. As the elevator climbed toward the top floor, Ruth stood silently beside him. She'd passed this elevator hundreds of times. Polished its buttons. Cleaned its corners. But never ridden it up past the 10th floor. I've worked here 12 years, she said suddenly. Didn't think I'd ever go up this high. Michael glanced at her. You might be surprised how quickly things can change. He didn't realize just how true that would turn out to be. When the doors opened to the executive suite, Ruth stepped into a different world. The air smelled of citrus and money. The floors were dark wood, shining like mirrors. Art hung on the walls. A sleek espresso machine hissed softly in the corner. As they walked past the glass offices, people looked up. They didn't see the janitor anymore. They saw something they didn't yet understand. And for the first time in a very long time, Ruth Langston was not invisible. Ruth sat across from Michael Granger, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her uniform still slightly damp from the mop water. She tried not to let her eyes linger too long on the sweeping city view behind him. Or the antique globe in the corner. Or the espresso tray that looked like it cost more than her monthly paycheck. She wasn't here to gawk. She was here because, somehow, she'd caught the CEO's attention, and she wasn't sure if that was a blessing or a warning sign. Michael leaned forward, elbows on his glass desk, eyes searching hers. I'll be honest, Ruth. I didn't expect my day to begin like this. I didn't either, she said, calm but cautious. What I saw downstairs, what I heard. That was Mandarin. And Spanish. And French. You switched between them like flipping light switches. Ruth didn't smile. She simply nodded. And you say you speak 9? Yes, sir. I grew up with English, but I studied Spanish in school, picked up French from a neighbor, taught myself the rest. Portuguese, German, Arabic, Italian, Swahili. Latin's just reading at this point. Michael blinked, sitting back. That's not something people just pick up. Ruth tilted her head slightly. It is if you don't stop learning. He looked down for a moment, as if weighing something. Then he looked up again. How did someone like you, someone with that kind of gift, end up here? In this building. Cleaning floors. She didn't answer right away. Her eyes flicked toward the window again, then back to him. Do you really want to know, or are you just being polite? I wouldn't have asked if I didn't mean it. Ruth took a breath, like she was bracing for something cold. I was born in Dayton, Ohio. My mom was a nurse's aide, my dad worked on air conditioning units. We didn't have much, but we had books. They pushed education hard. I got a full ride to Ohio State. Linguistics major. My dream was to work with embassies. I wanted to be a translator for the UN. Michael said nothing, just nodded slowly. Then my mom got sick. Early onset Alzheimer's. I came home to take care of her. Thought it'd be for a few months. Turned into 3 years. Then my dad passed suddenly. Heart attack in his sleep. Her voice didn't crack. Not once. I had a baby girl. No money. No help. Worked the night shift at a grocery store. Cleaned hotel rooms. Temp jobs. Eventually, someone told me about this place, Meriton. Night janitor. Flexible hours. Let me pick my daughter up from school. Michael stared at her. And the languages? I never stopped. Borrowed textbooks from the library. Read international newspapers. Listen to language tapes while scrubbing floors. It was the one thing I could still control. He leaned back, silent. Most people never asked, Ruth added. They saw the uniform. Assumed that was all there was. The last sentence lingered in the air like a fog. Michael felt it settle on his chest like a weight he didn't know he'd been carrying. She wasn't angry. She wasn't bitter. She was just honest. I'm not telling you this for pity, Ruth said. I'm not looking for a handout. You asked, and that's the truth. Michael ran a hand through his hair and stood up. He paced for a moment, the gears in his mind clearly turning. You ever think about doing something else? Ruth shrugged. All the time. But when the rent's due, dreaming feels like a luxury. There was a pause, thicker than before. Then Michael picked up a small notebook from the side of his desk and began jotting something down. What are you writing? She asked, not accusatory, just curious. He looked up at her. Ideas. She didn't press further, and he didn't explain. But one idea, in particular, had already taken root in his mind. And it was growing fast. Later that afternoon, long after Ruth had returned to the lower floors, Michael found himself distracted during a budget review meeting. He couldn't stop thinking about her. Not just the languages, but her poise. Her calm intelligence. Her dignity. At 3:45 p.m., he excused himself from a vendor call and rode the elevator to the service level. The air changed down there. It was warmer. Louder. Realer. No cappuccino machines or custom art, just buckets, crates, and hand sanitizer. He found Ruth in the supply room, restocking microfiber cloths. Mind if I bother you again? He asked. She turned, clearly surprised. You came down here. He smiled. Couldn't stop thinking about our conversation. She raised an eyebrow. Is that a good thing? I guess we'll find out, he said. I need a favor. Ruth set down the cloths. What kind? A group from our Sao Paulo office just arrived. Their translator cancelled. The meeting's in 15 minutes. Can you help? She paused only for a second. Portuguese. Yes. I can do that. 15 minutes later, Ruth was standing at the head of a sleek glass table in conference room 4C. Four Brazilian executives sat with tight expressions and restless hands. They clearly felt out of place. Then Ruth began to speak. The change was immediate. Shoulders relaxed. Eyes met. The room thawed. She didn't just translate, she connected. When one of the men cracked a joke, Ruth laughed and fired one back. Laughter followed. Michael stood in the back, arms crossed, watching it unfold like magic. He didn't understand a word, but he understood what was happening. A wall had come down. A bridge had been built. After 20 minutes, the meeting ended. One of the Brazilian men turned to Michael. She's better than any interpreter we've worked with this year, he said in accented English. Where did you find her? Michael glanced at Ruth, who was already stacking empty coffee cups onto a tray. Right here, he said softly. Ruth Langston hadn't been in an office chair like this in nearly 20 years. The leather was soft, the room too quiet. She sat across from Michael Granger again, not in a boardroom this time, but in a small side lounge off his main office, more private, more human. A tray of untouched pastries sat between them, and the smell of roasted espresso filled the air, though neither of them had poured a cup. Michael leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. I keep thinking about what you said earlier, he began, eyes steady on her. About how people assume things because of your uniform. Ruth gave a small nod. Happens a lot. You mop a floor and people assume that's all you know how to do. He took a slow breath. I want to understand the rest. You told me pieces, about your parents, your daughter. But what happened in between? How did a woman with your brain end up here, cleaning corporate conference rooms for 12 years? She gave him a look. Not defensive. Not offended. Just, measured. You sure you want the whole truth? I wouldn't be sitting here if I didn't. Ruth sat back, folding her arms across her chest, not closed off, just gathering strength. She glanced toward the window. The skyline shimmered in the distance. My parents weren't fancy people, she began. My dad fixed HVAC units, my mom worked the graveyard shift at a nursing home. They didn't have degrees, but they believed in books. My dad used to say, the world only listens if you speak its language. So I learned to speak as many as I could. Michael smiled faintly. Wise man. He was. We didn't have much, but we had a library card. That was enough. She paused. I was valedictorian. Got a full ride to Ohio State. Majored in linguistics. I was gonna get my master's, work for embassies, maybe the UN. That was the dream. What happened? She looked down at her hands, calloused from years of labor. My mom started forgetting things. At first, it was little stuff, leaving the stove on, misplacing keys. Then one day, she didn't recognize my face. I dropped everything and moved back home. Took care of her full time. Wasn't even 25. Michael nodded, quiet. She passed 2 years later. My dad couldn't take it. He was gone 6 months after her. Stroke in his sleep. I think it was heartbreak more than anything. She looked up at him again. Her eyes were tired, but there was fire behind them. And just like that, the future I planned evaporated. I had no degree, no savings, and a daughter on the way. The man who got me pregnant disappeared before the baby did. Michael leaned back in his chair. That's a lot. Ruth chuckled, but there was no humor in it. Yeah. It was. She shifted, as if adjusting the weight of the past on her shoulders. I worked wherever I could. Grocery store cashier. Hotel maid. Home health aide. Nothing stuck. Everything paid barely enough to survive. Then someone I knew from church mentioned a janitorial supervisor at Meriton. Said they were hiring. Night shifts. Decent benefits. So I applied. And you stayed, he asked. I stayed because it worked. I could be home in the morning to get my daughter ready for school. I could take her to doctor appointments. Help her with homework. I missed a lot, but I didn't miss the important stuff. Michael was quiet for a moment, digesting every word. And the languages? You didn't give up on them? She shook her head. Never. That part of me, I refused to let it go. I'd check out old textbooks from the library. Download free PDFs. I'd watch international news streams online. Read newspapers in 5 languages. I couldn't afford school anymore, but I could still learn. That takes discipline, he said softly. It takes sanity, she replied. Languages kept me grounded. They reminded me that I was still more than a mop. More than a paycheck. There was a long silence after that. Not awkward. Just heavy. Michael finally spoke again. You ever consider applying for anything else? Something different? She gave a small shrug. Sometimes. But it's hard to apply for jobs you've never been invited to imagine. That line hit him hard. Harder than he expected. He stood and walked slowly over to the window, looking out at the city but not really seeing it. Do you know how many consultants I've paid over the years to talk to me about diversity? About hidden talent? About finding leaders in unlikely places? He turned to face her. And the most capable, multilingual, emotionally intelligent person I've met in a decade has been working 2 floors below me, polishing elevator buttons. Ruth didn't respond. Not because she didn't care, but because she'd heard a lot of talk in her life. What mattered now wasn't words. It was what came next. Michael seemed to understand that too. He crossed the room, pulled a notebook from his shelf, and scribbled something on a sticky note. He handed it to her. "What's this?" she asked. "A temporary badge for the 12th floor. For now." "For what?" "I don't know yet. But I don't want you back on the service level tonight. I've got something in mind, and it starts tomorrow." Ruth stared at the note in her hand. A flimsy square of paper. But to her, it felt heavier than gold. "I still have my shift tonight," she said quietly. "Someone has to clean the 5th floor." He smiled. "I think we can manage without you for one night." She stood slowly, still unsure if this was real. Still half expecting to wake up in the janitor's closet with a mop handle pressing into her side. But it was real. And tomorrow, something was about to begin. Something she'd almost forgotten how to hope for. The next morning, Ruth Langston stood in front of a full-length mirror inside the executive restroom on the 12th floor, adjusting the borrowed blazer Michael Granger's assistant had handed her just 30 minutes earlier. It was a little too big in the shoulders, and the color was a soft gray she would have never picked for herself, but it covered the navy blue uniform she had worn for 12 years. For now, that was enough. Her name badge still said, Custodial Services, but the sticky note in her pocket, handwritten by the CEO himself, said something else entirely. She took a deep breath, then another. Her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed the front of the blazer. She wasn't nervous because she doubted her abilities. She was nervous because, for the first time in a long time, someone had decided to believe in them. A knock came at the door. Michael's assistant poked her head in. "They're ready for her in conference room 3B, she said gently. "Are you ready?" Ruth turned, nodded. "I guess we'll find out." Down the hall, the energy was different. Polished. Precise. A far cry from the hum of vacuum motors and mop buckets. Everything smelled like lemon oil and ambition. She entered conference room 3B to find 4 Brazilian executives seated around a sleek black table, flipping through presentation packets and checking their phones. Their translator had cancelled that morning due to a medical emergency, and the meeting, planned for months, was teetering on collapse. Until Michael had remembered Ruth. He was already in the room, seated at the far end of the table. When she entered, he stood. "Gentlemen," he said, gesturing. "This is Ruth Langston. She'll be assisting us today." All 4 men looked up at once. Their expressions shifted from confusion to mild surprise, then to curiosity. Ruth walked calmly to the center of the room, nodded respectfully, and greeted them in flawless Portuguese. "Bom dia. Prazer conhecê-los. Good morning. It's a pleasure to meet you." The air changed instantly. Shoulders dropped. Postures relaxed. Phones disappeared into pockets. Within seconds, Ruth was translating complex product specifications, contract language, and cultural nuances with the ease of a diplomat. She switched between technical terms and warm conversational tones as if she'd done this for years. When one of the executives cracked a joke, she chuckled and responded in kind, her tone matching his perfectly. The entire room burst into laughter. Michael sat quietly at the head of the table, watching it all unfold with a quiet awe. He didn't understand Portuguese, not really, but he didn't have to. He understood connection. He saw it in every smile, every nod, every leaned-in gesture. Ruth wasn't just translating words. She was building bridges. The meeting lasted nearly an hour. By the end, one of the executives, tall, silver-haired, with a reputation for being difficult to impress, leaned back in his chair and said in accented English, "She's better than any interpreter we've worked with all year." "Where did you find her?" Michael looked at Ruth, who was calmly stacking used coffee cups on a tray. "Right here," he said with a small smile. "She's been here all along." Outside the conference room, as the Brazilian team departed with handshakes and gratitude, Michael caught up with Ruth. "You ever do professional translation before?" he asked. She shook her head. "No time for school. No certificate. I just helped where I could. Hospitals. Government offices. Sometimes at church." "What about your daughter?" he asked. "She's 26 now," Ruth replied. "Works as a nurse in Tempe. Paid her own way through college. Stubborn like her mama." They both smiled. For a moment, it didn't feel like CEO and janitor. It felt like two people who had survived something. Back on the service level, Ruth clocked back in. She still had 2 more floors to clean before her shift ended. But before she picked up her cart, she turned to Michael and said something that caught him off guard. "I didn't do anything special today." He looked at her, surprised. "That's not how it looked to me." She smiled, just a little. "Sometimes, when you've had to prove yourself over and over, doing well starts to feel like survival." Then she picked up her mop and disappeared down the hall. That night, Michael sat in his car for a long time before driving home. The company was under pressure, new markets, investor demands, labor cuts, but his mind wasn't on any of that. His mind was on Ruth Langston. The talent they'd never noticed. The brilliance they'd walked past 1,000 times. He remembered something his father once told him back in his small Michigan hometown: "Sometimes the gold's not out in the hills, son. Sometimes it's buried right under your feet." The next morning, just after sunrise, Ruth finished wiping down the east lobby. Her back ached, and her hands were raw from chemical cleansers. She was about to return to the supply room when her supervisor, Ron, tapped her on the shoulder. "Hey, Ruth," he said with a half smile, half frown. "Mr. Granger wants to see you." "Again?" Ruth blinked. "Did I do something wrong?" "No idea," Ron shrugged. "He just told me to send you up." As she rode the elevator back to the 12th floor, something felt different. People looked at her. Not the way they had before, not with dismissal, but with curiosity. A few whispered. One of the receptionists even offered a polite smile, the kind people reserve for someone they think might be important. When she entered Michael's office, he was standing by the window, sipping coffee, staring out at the skyline like it held answers. "Come in," he said, not turning around just yet. She stood quietly near the door. "I've been thinking," he continued, placing his mug on the table. "About talent waste. About how many people get passed over, not because they're not good, but because nobody bothers to look twice." Ruth said nothing. She'd heard big talk before. But then he turned to her, and this time, his voice was different. "I want to create a new position. One that didn't exist before. Something this company needs, whether we knew it or not." She raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "Cultural liaison. International affairs. Someone who speaks the languages, understands the nuances, makes visitors feel at home, catches mistakes in contracts before they cost us millions. Someone who's already proven they can handle it, with grace, intelligence, and patience." Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. He continued, "You're more qualified than half the leadership team. Honestly, you've done more in 2 days than some folks here do in a month." Ruth stared at him. "Is this real?" she asked softly. "As real as it gets." "I don't have a college degree." "You have something better," Michael said. "You have lived experience. And you have 9 languages." She hesitated. "Why me?" "Because yesterday, before 9 a.m., I watched you solve 3 major problems in 3 different languages. And I'm tired of walking past people who do twice the work for half the credit." She crossed her arms. You know what people are going to say. I don't care. A beat passed between them. Then Ruth sighed and said what she never thought she'd say. All right then, she whispered. Let's see what I can do. The nameplate outside the modest office on the 12th floor had not yet been changed, but Ruth Langston now had a desk, a phone, a company email, and a title, Cultural Liaison, International Affairs. It didn't feel real yet. The office was small, just a desk, a potted plant, and a computer that still had sticky notes from the previous occupant, but to Ruth, it may as well have been the White House. She had never had a job that came with an actual office. She had spent most of her adult life with her name sewn onto polyester uniforms, not printed on letterhead. Her daughter, Camille, had screamed when Ruth told her the news over the phone. Mom, that's incredible. Do you even own office shoes? Ruth laughed. I own church shoes. Close enough. But the celebration didn't last long. By Wednesday morning, the whispers had begun. It started in the elevator, where two marketing assistants exchanged glances and lowered their voices as she stepped in. She's the janitor, right? One of them murmured. Was, the other corrected. Later that day, in the staff lounge, Ruth heard her name again, this time from two women in pencil skirts eating salads out of paper bowls. I'm just saying, one whispered. I have a master's in international business and I've been waiting 2 years for a promotion. She was scrubbing toilets last week. Her friend shrugged. Maybe she knows something we don't. Oh, please. It's just Kellerman trying to look progressive. Check a box. He'll forget about her in a month. Ruth didn't flinch. She walked past them with her head high, but inside, a part of her folded inward. She wasn't new to being underestimated, but this was a different kind of resistance. It wasn't just condescension. It was discomfort. Ruth had jumped the invisible ladder, and some people didn't like that. In conference calls, a few managers ignored her insights. In meetings, she was introduced as helping out with translation, rather than by her title. And when she passed by the reception area one morning, the receptionist smiled that overly polite smile, too wide to be genuine. It would have been easy to retreat. To go back to what was familiar. To quietly clean and blend in like before. But Ruth wasn't going backward. She'd spent too many years being invisible. Now that she was seen, she refused to shrink. Michael Granger noticed the shift in the building's atmosphere too. A few department heads had asked subtle questions, all wrapped in fake curiosity. So, what's her background again? Did she work for a nonprofit overseas or something? Was she, like, ex-CIA? Just curious. Even Victor Reynolds, head of international operations, had raised an eyebrow during a leadership check-in. She has no certifications, Michael. No management experience. I hope you know what you're doing. Michael simply replied, I do. But Ruth felt every stare, every pause in conversation when she entered a room, every compliment that sounded like a warning. Still, she did what she had always done, she worked. Quietly. Diligently. Brilliantly. She reviewed multilingual vendor contracts and found translation errors that had gone unnoticed for years, errors that had cost the company tens of thousands of dollars. She greeted visiting clients in their native tongue before the reception team could say, hello. She corrected an international shipping mix-up that had been bouncing between departments for a week, in under 20 minutes. She didn't brag. She didn't point fingers. She just did the job. That afternoon, she stopped by her old break room on the service level. Her old crew was on their lunch break, gathered around a folding table with lukewarm coffee and vending machine snacks. When Ruth walked in, they all stood a little straighter. Well, look who made it upstairs, joked Luis, the night shift supervisor. Ruth grinned. It's just a different view. Still the same floors, just shinier. They laughed and offered her a seat. She sat, shared some stories from her first few days, and listened to theirs like she always had. Before she left, she asked Luis, "You know that woman on the third floor who cleans the supply wing?" "Eileen," he said. "Yeah. Good worker. She reads Korean fluently," Ruth said. "Teaches herself in her spare time." Luis blinked. "You serious?" Ruth nodded. "She's next." That night, as she walked to her car under the buzzing garage lights, Ruth found herself thinking about how far she'd come, and how far there was still to go. Change didn't happen in one promotion. It happened when the system around you began to shift. But she knew one thing for sure. She had cracked the surface. And once a crack begins, it spreads. The next morning, she arrived early. Before the stares. Before the whispers. She stepped into her office, opened her laptop, and found a sticky note on her whiteboard that hadn't been there the night before. 3 simple words written in neat block letters. "We see you." She stared at it for a long moment. No name. No clue who left it. But it didn't matter. Because it meant someone was watching. Someone who needed to know that people like Ruth Langston could win. And that maybe, just maybe, they could too. The message came just after lunch. Ruth was reviewing a revised vendor agreement from Italy, cross-checking 2 translations that didn't quite match up, when Michael's assistant knocked softly on her door. "Ruth," she said quietly, "you're needed on the 17th floor. Room 7A. Now." Ruth looked up. "Did Michael ask for me?" The assistant shook her head. "No. Ms. Craig did." Ruth's stomach tightened. Eleanor Craig. Senior board member. 32 years with Meriton. Harvard Business School. Known for her impeccable suits, steel gray hair, and the uncanny ability to end careers with a sentence. Ruth had never met her. But she'd heard enough. Without another word, Ruth stood, grabbed her notebook, and made her way to the elevator. As the numbers lit up, 12, 13, 14, she steadied her breathing. By the time the doors opened on 17, her face was calm. Neutral. Prepared. Room 7A was smaller than she expected. Plain walls, no windows, a long wooden table. At the far end sat Eleanor Craig, flipping through a folder with sharp, deliberate movements. She didn't look up as Ruth entered. "Have a seat," Eleanor said, her voice flat. Ruth took the chair across from her. For a moment, the only sound was the turning of pages. Then Eleanor folded her hands and finally met Ruth's eyes. "So. Miss Langston." "Yes, ma'am. I've reviewed your personnel file. No college degree. No corporate experience. No certifications. 12 years in custodial services." Ruth nodded once. "That's correct." Eleanor arched a brow. "And now you're handling high-level international affairs?" "I am." The silence between them thickened. "Help me understand," Eleanor said, voice cold. "How someone with your background ends up here." Ruth didn't blink. She didn't flinch. She had waited her entire life for this moment, not to be challenged, but to answer. "Because I speak 9 languages," Ruth said. "Because I understand cross-cultural communication better than most people with master's degrees. Because I've already corrected 2 translation errors in vendor contracts that would have cost this company over $60,000, and because I helped resolve a 3-month delay with our Morocco expansion, in 4 days." Eleanor's lips pursed. "You think this company should be run on instinct and charm?" Ruth allowed herself the smallest smile. "No, ma'am. I think it should be run on results." That landed. Eleanor looked down at the folder again, flipping to another page. "You're a gamble," she said. Ruth's voice lowered, but didn't soften. "I'm used to that. My whole life's been one." A long pause followed. Then Eleanor closed the folder, slowly, and pushed it aside. "You're not what I expected. Most people say that." Another pause. This one not cold, but contemplative. "You have a lot of eyes on you, Miss Langston. I know. Not everyone wants to see you succeed." Ruth met her gaze head-on. "That's not new either." For the first time, something flickered in Eleanor's expression. A trace, just a trace, of respect. When the meeting ended, Ruth didn't go back to her office right away. She walked out of the building and crossed the street to a small public bench shaded by an oak tree. The late afternoon sun filtered through the leaves. The glass tower across the street shimmered like a mountain of mirrors. She stared at it. So many years, she had walked past that building. Worn that uniform. Held a mop in one hand and her dreams in the other, wondering if anyone ever saw her. Now they did. And some of them didn't like it. She pulled out her phone and called Camille. "Hey, Ma," her daughter answered, cheerful. "Everything okay?" Ruth hesitated. Then nodded to herself, even though Camille couldn't see it. "Yeah," she said. "Just needed to hear your voice." "You sure?" "I'm sure." They talked for a few minutes about nothing important, groceries, Camille's dog, a show she wanted to watch. Just the sound of her daughter laughing steadied something inside Ruth. After they hung up, she sat in silence for a while longer. Then she stood up, crossed the street, and walked back into the building. She rode the elevator to the 12th floor. And when she stepped off, she stood a little taller. The whispers were still there. The doubt hadn't vanished. But she wasn't going anywhere. And if they thought that meeting would scare her back into silence, they didn't know Ruth Langston. The next morning, word of the showdown had somehow made its way through the building. No one knew exactly what had been said, but they knew Ruth had walked in alone, and walked out standing taller. That day, she arrived early, hosted a team meeting with overseas partners, and answered a call from the German office without a translator. She was calm. Precise. Professional. At noon, someone scribbled a note on the whiteboard outside her office. No signature. Just 3 simple words. "We see you." Ruth stared at it. Then smiled. Because now, the world wasn't just watching her. They were waiting to follow. The 12th floor had grown quieter since Ruth Langston moved in. Not in the literal sense, printers still hummed, keyboards clicked, phones rang, but in the way people paused when she passed by. In the way conversation seemed to soften when she entered the room. Not out of hostility, exactly, but adjustment. Like they were recalibrating their perceptions in real time. At first, Ruth tried to ignore it. She had work to do. Real work. That morning alone, she had reviewed a distributor agreement from Italy, corrected a clause mistranslated from Arabic in a shipping document, and joined a call with a confused supplier in Jakarta, gently transitioning between English and Bahasa Indonesia, a 10th language she had been learning quietly for the past year. But despite the full schedule, Ruth noticed the shift. She noticed how people watched her. Not just the skeptics, but the silent ones. The ones who lingered just a moment longer in the hallway. The ones who smiled without speaking. The ones who, like she once had, were trying to figure out if they belonged in rooms like this. It started with small things. A young receptionist named Clarissa knocked on Ruth's door during lunch. "Sorry to bother you," she said, fidgeting with the hem of her sleeve, "but I heard you taught yourself languages. Is that true?" Ruth nodded. "Every one of them." Clarissa's voice dropped. "Do you think someone like me could do that too?" Ruth smiled. "Absolutely. One word at a time." Later that week, a facilities tech named Marcus, usually stationed in the underground parking structure, slipped her a printout of a Mandarin phrasebook. "I've been trying to learn this," he said, almost shy. My cousin just married a woman from Beijing, and I want to surprise her. Ruth looked over the list. It was messy, handwritten, and endearing. She corrected his tones with a pen and handed it back. Practice this one every morning. Say it in the mirror. You'll get there. Then came the emails. Short ones at first. From interns. Entry-level assistants. Even a night security guard. Hi Ms. Langston. Saw the article in the company newsletter. Didn't know someone like you could do that. Made me think, maybe I can too. Thanks for showing us. Ruth replied to every single one. No templates. No copy-paste. Just honest answers, encouragement, and time. What had started as a whisper of recognition was becoming something else, a current. Quiet. Steady. Spreading beneath the surface. She didn't ask for this role. She didn't even fully understand it yet. But people were watching. And not just watching, they were changing. One afternoon, Ruth was walking past the break room when she noticed Bao Nguyen, a soft-spoken intern from the finance department, sitting alone with a tattered Vietnamese English dictionary. He looked up nervously when she stepped in. Oh, hi, Ms. Langston. Call me Ruth, she said, smiling. What ya working on? Bao blushed. I'm trying to improve my Vietnamese. My parents spoke it, but I never really learned. I guess I'm trying to reconnect. My grandfather's sick back home, and I'd like to speak to him properly before. He trailed off. Ruth pulled out a chair and sat beside him. They spent the next 30 minutes practicing vowel sounds and sentence flow. When Bao smiled, embarrassed by his accent, Ruth simply said, "Your voice is the most beautiful when it's trying." Before she left, he asked, "How did you learn all those languages, really?" She paused. Then said softly, one word at a time. "Same way you will." That night, Michael Granger joined her for coffee in the employee lounge. It was past 6 p.m., and most of the executive team had already left. He leaned on the counter, watching her stir sugar into her mug. "Been hearing good things," he said. She glanced at him. "I've been trying to ignore the bad ones." "You're making waves, Ruth. That a good thing?" He chuckled. "Around here? It means you're doing something right." They stood in companionable silence. Then Michael added, "I've been thinking about something. What if we built a training program? Internal development. Focused on people working non-desk roles. Janitorial, facilities, kitchen staff, anyone who's never been given a shot." Ruth's eyes lit up. "There are more of me in this building," she said. "They just haven't been seen yet." He turned to face her directly. "Would you help me build it?" She didn't hesitate. "Already started in my head." By month's end, the pilot was approved. It would be called Voice Within, a program aimed at giving unseen workers a path to visibility, language courses, leadership mentorship, cultural fluency workshops. And Ruth Langston would lead it. Not as a symbol, but as a blueprint. The whispers in the hallways were still there. But they were starting to change. No longer just gossip or doubt. Now, they were laced with curiosity. With respect. And for some, with hope. The ballroom in Cincinnati's downtown convention center was packed wall to wall. Over 300 professionals from across the country sat at round tables dressed in crisp linen. Name tags sparkled. Laptops were open. Caffeine buzzed in every corner. This was the annual Logistics Leadership Summit, a gathering of CEOs, operations directors, and international consultants. And now, for the first time in its 20-year history, the keynote speaker was someone who had once polished the floors of those same conference rooms. Ruth Langston stood behind the podium, hands resting gently on the sides, heart steady. She wore a beige blazer Camille had picked out for her, a simple pearl necklace that used to belong to her mother, and the calm demeanor of someone who had nothing left to prove, but everything to share. She glanced down at her notes, just bullet points, no script. Then she looked out over the crowd and began. When I was first asked to speak here, I thought someone had dialed the wrong number. A soft ripple of laughter passed through the room. I've never owned a briefcase. I've never been a manager. I didn't graduate from a prestigious university. I've never even been on a business flight. But I've negotiated peace between people who didn't speak the same language. I've saved companies money by catching mistakes no one else noticed. And I've done all of that wearing a name tag and holding a mop. The room fell still. I was never just a janitor, she said. I was fluent. I was capable. I was ready. But nobody ever looked long enough to see it. A long pause. No shuffling. No murmurs. Just silence. Then she leaned forward slightly. So the next time you pass someone without a title, someone restocking the vending machine, wiping the glass door, handing you your mail, ask yourself, what are you really missing? Because sometimes brilliance doesn't come with a resume or a designer suit. Sometimes it's standing 5 feet away, hoping someone will finally look up. For a few seconds, the room didn't move. Then the first person stood. Then another. And another. Until the entire ballroom rose to its feet in thunderous applause. Ruth didn't cry. She didn't need to. Because in that moment, she knew she hadn't changed who she was to earn the applause. She had simply shown the world the parts of her that had always been there. As she stepped down from the stage, a young man approached her near the exit. He wore a cheap tie and clutched a conference folder to his chest. My mom's a housekeeper, he said quietly. She speaks 5 languages. I used to be embarrassed to say that. But today, his voice cracked. Today, I stood a little taller because of you. Ruth gently touched his arm. Don't ever be ashamed of where you come from, she said. The only thing to be ashamed of is staying blind to brilliance. Back at Meriton, the ripple effect had already begun. The pilot program voice within was gaining traction. New applicants from all corners of the company, cafeteria workers, warehouse staff, receptionists, were signing up for language courses, mentorships, and visibility workshops. The glass door outside the training center no longer read Training Room A. It now had a brushed steel plaque that said simply, The Langston Room. There was no ribbon cutting. No press release. Just a quiet, deliberate recognition that things were shifting. Later that afternoon, Michael Granger stood outside the room as a group of summer interns filed in. He overheard one whisper, Who's Langston? A senior staffer replied, She's the reason this place finally learned how to see people. Upstairs, Ruth returned to her office to find a sealed envelope on her desk. No return address. No department stamp. Just her name, Ruth Langston, written in careful block letters. Inside was a short note. I used to think I'd be invisible forever. But today, I stood a little taller because of you. Thank you. No signature. Just proof that someone else had been watching. And more importantly, someone had felt seen. Ruth sat quietly for a moment, rereading the note. She didn't know who had written it. But she knew exactly what it meant. Because years ago, she had been that person, tired, unseen, working in the corners of a world that never looked her way. And now, because one person finally had. She had turned her mop into a microphone. Her silence into a spotlight. Her story into a doorway. But Ruth also knew one thing with certainty. Not every door stays open without a fight. And somewhere inside that building, someone was already planning to push back. By Friday morning, the brushed steel plaque outside the training center gleamed in the sunlight spilling through the atrium windows. The Langston Room. No fanfare. No speeches. Just 5 words that changed the way the building felt. Ruth didn't ask for the honor. She didn't even know it was coming. Michael had arranged it quietly, just a conversation with facilities and a signed memo. The plaque went up overnight, and by morning, everyone noticed. Some smiled. Some frowned. Some whispered. But Ruth wasn't thinking about that. She was in the middle of reviewing onboarding materials for the next round of Voice Within participants when she heard the knock. A sharp, purposeful knock. Her assistant peeked in, looking nervous. "Ruth, Ms. Craig asked to see you." Ruth paused, closed her folder slowly, and stood. The last time Eleanor Craig had summoned her, it felt like a trial. This time, it felt worse. Room 17B was smaller than the one before. No view, no windows. Just a rectangular table, white walls, and the smell of new carpet. Eleanor sat at the head of the table, flanked by two unfamiliar men, one in HR, the other from legal. A closed folder rested in front of her, her hands folded tightly on top. "Have a seat, Miss Langston," she said, without looking up. Ruth sat. There was no greeting. No smile. Just tension. Eleanor opened the folder slowly. "We've been reviewing your file." Again. Ruth said nothing. Still no degree. Still no professional certifications. And no documented international business experience. Ruth waited. "I understand your story is inspiring. And that Mr. Granger has chosen to invest in you. But personal narratives and emotional reactions are not qualifications." The words landed like cold stones across the table. Ruth took a quiet breath. "I've already translated for 4 international delegations this month. I corrected 2 contract discrepancies that saved this company over $75,000. I helped re-establish communication with the Moroccan office after a 3-month stalemate. And last week, I spoke at a national logistics summit on behalf of Meriton Global." Eleanor didn't blink. "You've made waves, yes. But waves are not stability. And Meriton needs stability." "You mean safety," Ruth said softly. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "I mean sustainability. And long-term credibility." One of the men beside her spoke. "We've had anonymous complaints from leadership. Concerns about skipping protocol, favoritism, and disruption of workplace hierarchy." "Disruption," Ruth repeated. "That's one word for it." Eleanor leaned forward slightly. "Let me be clear, Miss Langston. This is not personal. It's professional. It's about ensuring proper structure." "I understand structure," Ruth replied. "I've scrubbed the corners of this structure for 12 years. The room fell silent. Then Ruth added, "You think this is about me. But it's not. It's about the people who are watching. The ones who are still in the break rooms, wearing name tags no one reads. The ones who now believe, because of a small plaque on a door, that they might be seen one day too." The man from legal shifted in his chair. Eleanor's jaw tensed. Then Ruth said, firmly, "I didn't ask for that plaque. But if you take it down, if you push me out, then you're not just sending a message to me. You're sending it to every quiet worker who dared to hope." Eleanor didn't reply. Instead, she stood and slowly closed the folder. "You're a disruption," she said again. "And you are still a risk." Ruth stood, too. But this time, she didn't look small in comparison. She didn't shrink. "I've been a risk since the day I walked in here with a mop and a mind full of languages." Then she turned and walked out. The door clicked behind her like the end of a chapter. She didn't cry. She didn't break. She just walked, to the elevator, then to her floor. And as she stepped off, she saw it. A group of interns standing outside the Langston room, waiting for orientation. They stood a little straighter when they saw her. One of them smiled and gave a small, nervous wave. Ruth smiled back. She didn't say a word. But her presence said everything. That afternoon, Michael stopped by her office. He leaned on the doorframe, his face unreadable. "I heard Eleanor called you up." "She did," Ruth said. "Wasn't exactly a warm welcome." "She trying to scare you?" "She's trying to put me back in the closet." He nodded slowly. "You gonna let her?" Ruth looked up. "No," she said. "But she's not the only one watching. So I have to be better. Smarter. Unshakable." Michael stepped inside, pulled the door shut behind him. "You're doing more than shaking things up," he said. "You're changing the culture. That scares people." "I'm not here to make people comfortable," she replied. "I'm here to make sure no one else has to be invisible again." Michael smiled. "That's why I chose you." Then he handed her a small envelope. "What's this?" she asked. "A request," he said. "From the board. They want you to speak at the next executive retreat." Ruth raised an eyebrow. "Why?" "Because they've finally realized that leadership doesn't always wear a tie." She opened the envelope. Inside was a printed invitation. Speaker proposal, Ruth Langston, visibility, voice, and the future of leadership. She read it twice. Then looked up. "I'll do it," she said. "But I'm not changing my story." Michael laughed. "Good. That's the whole point." And as he left the room, Ruth turned back to her desk. Outside her door, the name still gleamed. The Langston Room. It hadn't been taken down. Not today. And Ruth Langston wasn't going anywhere. On a rainy Tuesday morning, Ruth Langston walked into Meriton Global's headquarters and barely noticed the stairs anymore. Not because they had stopped, but because they had changed. Some were still laced with quiet judgment. Others with awe. But most were something else now, respect. It had been 3 months since her name was etched onto the brushed steel plaque outside the Langston Room. 2 months since she stood before Meriton's board and spoke, not from a script, but from the deepest, most personal part of her life. And 1 month since Michael Granger announced the official expansion of the Voice Within program to all 8 Meriton locations across the country. But none of that compared to what she found on her desk that morning. A small folder. No logo. Just a sticky note with 2 words in neat handwriting. "For you." Inside was a letter. Typed, but signed in blue ink. "Dear Ms. Langston. I applied to Meriton twice. Never got a call back. Probably because I checked warehouse instead of business. But last week, I heard about a training program led by a woman who used to mop these floors, and now leads entire departments. So I applied again. And this time, I got in. I guess I just wanted to say thank you. For being the kind of woman who didn't slam the door when it finally opened. But left it open for the rest of us. Sincerely. DeAndre Harris." Ruth stared at the letter for a long time. Then slowly folded it and tucked it into the small drawer beside her keyboard. That drawer had once held her old janitor badge. She hadn't looked at it in weeks. But now, she opened it again. The badge was still there. Faded. Scratched. A little bent at the corners. She picked it up, turning it over in her hand. 12 years she wore that badge. 12 years of overlooked greetings, late-night shifts, and empty break rooms. And yet, without that chapter of her life, she never would have understood the value of being seen. Later that day, Ruth walked into a Voice Within mentoring circle with 3 new employees, 2 from custodial services, 1 from the cafeteria. She greeted them warmly and sat in the circle, not at the head of the table, but with them. "You all belong here," she said. "Don't wait for someone else to hand you permission." One of the women, a single mom named Gloria who had been working night shift for 7 years, asked quietly, how did you do it? How did you keep going when nobody was paying attention? Ruth smiled. Because I wasn't doing it to be seen. I was doing it to stay ready, in case someone ever did. A few days later, Michael stopped by her office with a visitor in tow, a senior VP from a global partner company in Geneva. She's the one I told you about, Michael said proudly. Speaks 9 languages. Built the most successful internal development program we've ever had. Started as a janitor. The visitor's eyebrows lifted. A janitor? Ruth extended her hand, steady and calm. Not just a janitor, she said. A translator. A teacher. A builder. Titles don't define people. Actions do. That night, Ruth sat in her car after everyone else had gone home. Rain tapped gently on the windshield. The parking lot was almost empty. The world felt still. She looked up at the glass tower that had once seemed unreachable. Then down at her old badge in her hand. She smiled. Not because she made it to the top, but because she'd made space for others to follow. She didn't throw the badge away. She placed it back in the drawer, carefully. Not to forget. But to remember. Because this story was never just about her. It was about the voices never heard. The faces never looked at twice. The gifts buried under uniforms and silence. And now, thanks to one conversation, one chance, one open door, they would be silent no longer. As she locked her office and stepped into the hallway, she noticed someone standing by the Langston room door. A young maintenance worker. Maybe early 20s. Nervous. He turned when he saw her. "I'm next, right?" he asked. Ruth smiled. "You just might be." And then she kept walking, her heels soft against the polished floor. Leaving the door wide open behind her.